So I'm going to attempt to do technical support one more time for myself here and see if I can't figure out. Nope, not mine, not mine. Oh, look, that one's called Lauren Keynote. So I get the pleasure this morning. Yesterday you got to hear sort of where we were organizationally at NetHope. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about trends that we see shaping the work that we do and the way that we think about the impact of technology on the work that all of our member organizations and our partners are interested in doing. And I'm gonna be somewhat provocative this morning. Maybe not. I mean, maybe this will be the most obvious thing in the world to you. But I want to be a little bit provocative because I want to think and look maybe 3 or 4 or 10 years down the road, depending on how quickly we can move. And I want to start with a quote that came from Eric Schmidt of Google last year in January. And he said, almost all of the world's problems, all the problems that we face, can be solved by more broadband connectivity. How many folks in this room would agree with that? So the other technologists that were sitting on the table, thanks, Shelly. Shelly's in, and everybody else is like, okay. All of the other technologists that were sitting on the stage with him at the time, everybody nodded their head. Oh yes, absolutely. That's what we need. We need more broadband connectivity. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, because only Shelly raised her hand, not everybody buys this argument. Right? Not everybody believes that this is actually true, and I will argue that when he said this, you know, a lot of people ridiculed him, gave him a hard time. Well, of course, Eric Schmidt would say that. Eric Schmidt has to believe that. But I would argue that he was about half right. Okay, I've got to know, how many people think this glass is half full? How many people think this glass is half empty? Okay, my 9-year-old told me last week, Mom, it's 100% full. It's just the other 50% is air. Right, exactly. Outsmarted by a 9-year-old. But I'll argue that Schmidt was probably 50% right. And I believe that broadband connectivity is going to have a huge impact on all of the work that we do. And if you have a chance, if you actually have a chance to watch that panel, it was called the Future of Technology at Davos last year, and Sheryl Sandberg and Satya Nadella and Eric and the Salesforce folks and a number of people were up there, and it was actually really, really fascinating because they were all talking really around the same topic, but they took very different approaches to it. So if you've got 45 minutes, it's actually really worth watching. It was quite good. And I'll argue that he was 50% right because I do believe that connectivity is part of the issue, but I also believe that the other part of it is data. And over the next few minutes, I want to spend some time thinking about why I believe that's true and posit an argument that we should think about collectively as a community in the way that we think about technology impacting the work that we do in the field. But first, I want to take a moment and think about how do we use connectivity today? And we all rely on connectivity. Right? I mean, last night in the hotel, my internet connection was going up and down and up and down and up and down. And, you know, I was like, I've got to get online. Now, the world will not stop if I have to wait 5 minutes for my internet connectivity to come back. And I remember having a conversation with a guy one time who talked about that. It was before Wi-Fi was on planes, but he talked about, you know, getting on the plane, waiting to the very last minute so you could get every last email, and then on a 4-hour flight, that sense of loss that you had from not having connectivity for those hours. What happened to us, right? But we're all in that space. But let's think about the way that we use connectivity organizationally these days. We all use connectivity to drive operational efficiency, especially from headquarter to field, right? Better, cheaper, faster. How do we make sure the communications happen? How do we make sure that people get the information that they need in a timely manner? All of that makes sense. We use it for data collection and analysis, right? We go out into the field, our people go out into the field, we collect data and we send that data back. No longer do we have to wait 3 months for boxes of paper to come back to headquarters and get the data. Now we can do it mobilely. It's great. We share knowledge. We send things out to the communities that we serve. We send things out to our field offices. Our field offices share insight back to us. All of that information flowing around. And of course, we use it for program efficiency and scale, right? We use connectivity to make sure that we have a broader impact. And certainly one of the things that I've learned over the almost now 2 years is that, looking at connectivity and how we connect the work that we do and use connectivity to scale out that impact is really critically important for all of our member organizations. How do we use data? Well, we use it to design programs. What does the data tell us? What should we be doing? We look at that data and we figure it out. We look at what the impact was, right? How do we measure our programs? Did we do what we were supposed to do, right? There are more working groups on measurement and evaluation than we can shake a stick at, right? We're all struggling with this question. And of course, we use it for crisis informatics, right? When we need to make decisions quickly, how do we actually surface that data so that it can help us make better decisions? All of those are great uses of connectivity and data, but they aren't nearly enough. Never. That's not going to get us to the point that we want to get to. I will argue, I would posit, that while we've made some progress, we have to do a lot more. And the problem is there's not enough money, there's not enough time, there's not enough people to keep throwing at this problem in the way that we've been approaching this problem over the last 30 years. And so we've got to look at a different way to do it. And I'll suggest that the unintended benefits of connectivity will ultimately have a much greater impact on the work that we do than anything else. And those are not the benefits that we expected, right? It's the unintended piece there that's important. We all expect to be able to connect. We all expect to be able to do things better, faster, cheaper. All of that makes sense. But the things that surprise us when we start thinking about connectivity, think back 15, 20 years. If someone had told you that before you got on a plane to go somewhere interesting, to do something interesting, you would feel a sense of loss because you could not talk into a small metal thing in your hand, would you have believed him? So, no, that's ridiculous. I'm going to go on a plane. I'm going to go somewhere interesting. I'm going to go do something that makes me feel good. I'm not going to worry about this phone. But we all do. And it's because it's those things that surprise us, those things that are insights that we didn't expect to have that we need to look at. Now, I'll argue that the unintended benefits of connectivity are three. One, exponential scale. You start connecting people. I mean, if you know anything about computer science, if you know anything about the way networks work, if you think about Metcalfe's law, right? Like scale is the thing that gets us there, and connecting those pieces are the things that get us to scale. It also creates massive amounts of data. Massive amounts of data. Every time that you connect online, that's data. And everybody, I mean, I've used the slides at NetHope. We've all seen the slides, right? 204 million emails every minute. 67,000 hours of YouTube video uploaded every minute, right? It's just massive amounts of data. And what's not even reflected in that is, where were you? What kind of network were you on? All the data pieces that come with that are also included. And I'll also argue that the third piece of that is that this complexity with all of this data, this complexity with all of this stuff that happens, also yields a tremendous amount of simplicity. And if we can get to that point of simplicity, that's where the magic sits. The problem is, getting to that simplicity is really hard. I think these are related. Connectivity yields data, data yields complexity, complexity yields simplicity, and simplicity yields scale. And I think if we think about things in that way and we think about the impact that can have on our work, it could be potentially really interesting in the way that we approach what we do over the next couple of years. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about that. There are 3 billion mobile subscriptions in this world. Everybody's seen the data, and I'm now making up statistics, but they're directionally right? Like 110% of people in India have mobile phone subscriptions. I don't know how that's possible, but it works out that way. It's a tremendous amount of subscriptions that actually show up every year. They're growing at a tremendous rate. 85% of the world, geographically speaking, has GSM and Edge global coverage today. Now, we still have a long way to go, and in fact, by 2017, which is not that far away, we expect 90% of the world to be covered, and 50% of the world to be covered by 4G. I'm not taking away the challenges that we all face in the field, but that's an enormous amount of coverage. When you think that, back when we were all in school, okay, well, when I was back in school, the percentage covered was 0, right? That is a huge growth, and it's growing very, very quickly. So the connectivity issues that we face, while not solved, are getting there. And that's yielding data, a lot of data. There are currently 5 zettabytes of data. And, the collective knowledge of the human, of humans today is 5 zettabytes of data. Every spoken word ever uttered by any human on the face of the earth is, since millennia, is only 1 exabyte. So you start doing that math, and you think, well, that's a lot of data. And in fact, and I had to double check this, it's that many zeros. You can, if you put that on CDs, and you go up to the moon and back, you could do that 20 times, right? And CDs are little, right? That's a long way to go. So that's a lot of information. Most of it, in fact, has happened in the last, really, 30 years. 30%, data grows at 30% year over year, and it's been doing that at a consistent rate for 30 years, right? So just kind of grok that for a second. A lot of data. 99.5% of it is digital. 30 years ago, 1% of it was digital. Of that that's digital, we analyze less than 1% of it. And in reality, some of it's probably not interesting. How many people saw the Facebook announcement maybe 15 days ago, 2 weeks ago, that said that 70% of people reorganize the dishwasher when someone else in their family has put the dishes in the dishwasher? Yeah, you're all laughing because everybody does this. I actually think it's much higher and that somebody just didn't say yes. So sometimes the data is really useful. Sometimes it makes for funny memes on Facebook. And sometimes it's not. We actually estimate that about 25% of the data that, collectively speaking, is actually probably really actionable. But of that 25%, we actually analyze less than half of 1%. So there's a lot of information out there that is simply untapped. We're just not getting to it. And frankly, we're not even really sure how to put it all together, right? How do we go tackle that problem? One way we do it is we look at crisis informatics. And everybody's seen, I hope everybody has seen, the tremendous work that Jennifer Chan and her team and a tremendous group of volunteers have done when this came out of Ebola. She's done similar work in Nepal. She's currently doing similar work with regards to the Syrian refugees. But if you take a look, at what's being surfaced here, right? Where are Ebola treatment units? Where is their coverage? Where are the rivers? Where are their cities? And so on and so forth. That data, we could put it on an Excel spreadsheet, and it would be the very same data, but this makes it much easier to access, right? When you then overlay infection rates and where infection rates are growing versus where they were decreasing, what we needed to do became really obvious, right? And so one of the ways that we start to get to data and start to analyze this data in actionable ways is we use visualizations. We use the tools that are necessary to do it. We use what tech companies call BI. We use business intelligence. Let's go look at all the data and see what it tells us, right? And that's a great way for us to use data. That's going to get harder, though, because the Internet of Things, that 30% year-over-year growth, the 5 zettabytes, is going to explode over the next 10 or 15 years. There are 50 billion sensors in the world today. How many people have a pedometer, a Fitbit, something or another? Right. Okay, well, everybody in this room, there's your sensor, right? And those are ones that are connected. There's 50 billion sensors out there today. 20 billion of them are connected. They expect 1 trillion sensors by 2020, of which 30 billion will be connected, although Jan just said it was going to be 50 billion, and I trust him over this data, which is probably 8 months old. All of those sensors produce data, lots of data, consistently, all day long. Data point, data point, data point. Oh, there's some more data. Data point, data point, data point. So how are we going to get to that data? And do we need to get to that data? Data is good. Data helps us understand things. More data is better. Quality data is best. But one of the things that's really interesting is when you look at machine learning, we don't actually have to do that data. When I worked for Microsoft, and Jane and James, this phrase will be very familiar to you, we used to do these data wallows. We'd get market data, and we'd all sit in a room with these big spreadsheets, and we'd just wallow in the data. You know, we'd say, oh, look, cell number whatever. Look at that thing. What does that tell us? And you'd go back and you'd dig through other spreadsheets and you'd see if there was something that connected to it. And sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. They were great fun. Sometimes they yielded results. Most of the time, we just ate 3 or 4 pounds of M&Ms and 57, cups of coffee, and then really came away knowing data points, but not necessarily knowing how to make it actionable, not knowing what it really told us. And one of the things that's really, really hard about data is that you know a lot of facts, but what insight are you actually gaining from it? And that's really where the challenge is going to come when all of this data becomes available. And as more and more data gets created, what insights are we going to pull from it? And it's one of the places that I think that machine learning becomes really interesting. Accessing structured data and running charts against it and being able to put it in a format that is more easily digestible, that's relatively easy. But when you start looking at Facebook posts, tweets, where cell phones were roaming, all of this data that is out there, and trying to figure out how you make sense of it. The way we do it today is, we do a snapshot of, 57 people who were on Twitter, and we read them all, and we get a sense of what was happening. But what's happening in the marketing world is all of that data is getting thrown into platforms, and it is not only telling us what consumers are really saying, it turns out, since 2004, that is a better predictor of human behavior than what people tell you they are going to do. If someone calls me and says, are you going to vote for Hillary Clinton, or are you going to vote for such and such and such and such, depending on the way that it was answered, the question was posed, the way that, I may have one answer. Well, actually, I would never have a different answer, but I might have one answer one day. I might have one answer, one day. And if someone calls me and said, are you going to buy a white washing machine or a black washing machine? Depending on what kind of mood I'm in, if my glass is half full or half empty, maybe I'm buying white, maybe I'm buying black. But it turns out if you actually analyze my Facebook post and my friend's Facebook's post, that is a more accurate predictor of what activities I'm going to do. And we only know that because we can take vast amounts of unstructured data, look at it, and over time and over massive amounts of data, predict what is actually going to happen. And it's remarkably accurate. Now, it is not accurate if you just ask me. That's one data point. But millions of data points, that's way more interesting. The other thing I'll say is, while Facebook is interesting and dishwashers are interesting and all of that is fascinating, it's actually really interesting in terms of, it's much more interesting to think about the actual implications. So there was a medical researcher who took a bunch of data around markers in breast cancer tumors and said, if I took all of this data over years and years and years of women from all different walks of life, all different stages of cancer, what are the indicators that are most important and most predict whether or not this particular cancer is survivable or not? That is a critical question. If you are diagnosed with breast cancer, you want to know, what are my chances? The medical literature identifies 9 markers. The computer models identified 12. And it turns out in testing those 12 over the last 2 years, the 3 that the medical literature had never identified are actually stronger indicators of survivability than the 9 that the medical literature had discovered over the last several years. That was just a computer taking a whole bunch of look at a whole bunch of data and saying, wow, this is connected to this, and this is connected to this, and this is connected to this. And it turns out it's doing that at millions of this to this to this to this to this a second. And it's telling us, it's giving us insight that we didn't have before that turns out is really actionable. So more data is better. It allows us to ask new questions. It allows us to get new answers. No one knew to ask about those other 3 indicators. Never even occurred to anybody. Lots of people have been working on breast cancer for a very long time. But when we look at data differently, when we visualize it differently, when we let a very dispassionate computer take a look at it, new questions and new answers surface, and that becomes important. It allows us to discover things. And like I said, it gets us to a point of predictability, which is really interesting when we start to think about when we start to talk about individual behavior and what we think will happen if we take certain actions. So data is important, but data yields complexity, right? Lots of data, it gets to be very hard. We got to figure out a way to get to it. This is the London Tube map. First time I went to London, as a kid who grew up in a town in Texas that had one stoplight, you know, I walked uphill in the rain, you know, both ways to school every day. That's not true. But, you know, like this was incredibly intimidating to me. There's a lot of data on this. You know, if I've got to get from point A to point B, it turns out if I only look at the two things I need to know, I need to get from Paddington to somewhere else, that's just 2 data points. That's actually pretty simple. And so you can use visualizations to take a lot of complicated data, surface it, and then find the 2 things that you want to know. Show you another one. This is the global food system. This does not help me decide what to eat for dinner. It tells me where it comes from, tells me where it goes. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of data here. There's a lot of decisions that I could make based off of this, but it doesn't actually help me figure out, do I want rye bread or white bread? Where's the peanut butter? How do I get that? What's interesting is you got to get to the point of simplicity. You got to take that complexity and you got to make it simple. Simple things are functional. Simple things are easy to use. Simple things are very clear in their purpose. They're inexpensive relative to their value. Simple things are, in fact, simple, but they can be exceptionally powerful. My favorite example is a rock. A rock is probably the, I don't know, penultimate definition of a simple thing, right? Imagine a rock. But if you take that rock and you take a lot of those rocks and you put them together, you get a cathedral. And that's really complicated. There's lots of complexity in there. So how do we actually think about, wow, if I look at that cathedral, where did that come from? Oh, that came from a rock. So if I look at this rock, that could be useful. It's simple. It's something I can use. It's something that's actionable. So how do we go back? How do we go from the point of the global food system to what I'm eating for dinner? Well, you go to a grocery store where it turns out all that complexity simply comes into, Lauren, you can choose this or you can choose this. It's very easy. Really gets quite simple. And when you combine that with data, it gets really interesting. You may not know it. This is one of the most important medical devices that's currently available in Africa. A guy took a bunch of data around, a medical doctor, took a bunch of data. Some guy was like, hey, let's take some data. Although that happens as well. Took a bunch of data around kidney function and said, how can you predict kidney function? Well, it turns out if you take this paperclip and you run it through the printing machines that they use for comic books with soy-based ink, and then you dip it in urine, the comic book inks will turn different colors based on kidney function. You can then take a cell phone, snap that picture, and send it to someone, a nephrologist somewhere, who can look at the picture of the now colored paperclip and say, wow, you're very healthy. Or, wow, you have a problem and you need to go find a doctor. That is a lot of complexity that got very, very simple. It does not require a doctor on one end. It requires a guy who can figure out how to dip a paperclip into urine. That's simple, it's actionable, it's clear in its purpose, and it is definitely cost effective. Right? And then you've got doctors somewhere else, because of connectivity, that can make an assessment based on that. All of that is based on data on the back end that we otherwise, if we hadn't taken a look at it, would not have known we could do that. Another great example. Anybody know what company this is? Think about the complexity involved with Uber. Right? All these different cars. You got to know where they are. There's a payment system. You've got to pay them. They've got to get paid. The company's got to take their share. You've got to get the rating system, so on and so forth. But all we have to do is push that little button on the phone, and a car shows up in front of your house or in front of the restaurant, wherever you are. All of that complexity on the back end is made simple. And as a result, we all use it. Or a lot of people use it. And that, I think, is the really interesting thing about how do we take all that data and make it simple so that people can use it. And the reason that that's important is because simple things scale. Simple things scale really, really easily. Everybody uses paper clips. We could have come up with something more complicated. I would argue that the stapler is fundamentally more complicated than a paper clip. And you probably have more paper clips than staplers, right? It's just, simple things work. And with scale comes impact. And so if we start to think about how we have impact, we're going to have to do that at scale. And so I go back to this notion that if we have connectivity, then we get more data. If we use visualization and we use business intelligence, if we use machine learning, we can get to a point where the complex data is all together. And if we allow ourselves to ask different questions and think differently, we will come up with simple answers to address really hard problems. And I don't think that always, sometimes, I don't think that always that hard problems require hard solutions. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. If you get a chance, go talk to Jennifer about some of her experiences in the field. And I am sure that everyone in this room has had this experience. But you come up with a great idea. And you've got a phone, and we've got an M&E system, and we're going to go figure this thing out. And she goes out to talk to people, and they say, oh, yeah, that's great. But that was really hard. So what we did was we just took this paper clip and the phone and a piece of grass and a spoon, and it turns out we, solved malaria. Right? Like those things happen because innovation happens when people are given tools that are simple and have a function. There's a guy, he's got several TED Talks. You should go and watch them. His last name is Whiteside. I can't think of his first name right now. But he's got this great line where he says, give me one or two well-designed technology tools and I will change the world. Because they're applicable to any number of issues. They're applicable to any number of problems. So if we look at connectivity and data, they are the underlying issues. They are the underlying things that if we can tackle them, if we can get our heads around them, if we can figure out how to address those issues, we might be able to go surface solutions, hopefully simple solutions, to a lot of really hard problems. So I would argue is not only are they related, it's actually a virtuous cycle. And that one drives the other. And if we continue to keep a focus on this connectivity, the data, the scale, the complexity, the simplicity, and we ask ourselves the questions that are necessary in order to do that, we might actually be able to do something. And again, I go back to the idea that this unintended benefit is ultimately going to have way more impact than us individually. And way more impact than the way that we're currently working, because we simply can't scale enough to get to all of the problems that are out there. Now, that is not to say, by any stretch of the imagination, that the work that our member organizations and our partners do is not meaningful. It is. Because if we weren't out there and we weren't working in these communities, we wouldn't even have the opportunity to ask these questions. But it is part of the challenge that we're facing when we think about how do we do things differently in order to go solve these problems. It's not just a question of doing more or doing more with less or doing it better, faster, cheaper. It's a question of doubling down and saying, how do we actually change the equation? Jan Geldmacher talked about disrupting. How do we actually go and disrupt our own businesses? How do we go and disrupt our own way of approaching things? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. It means we take a step back and we say, what does the data tell us? What are the opportunities that are in front of us? And if we learn something different, are we brave enough to go out and do something different? That's a much harder question, but it's one I think we have to ask. So I think the unintended benefits are things we have to look at. I think we as NetHope have three opportunities here. One, I think we have to demand more connectivity. I think it is absolutely phenomenal what the telecommunications companies, and I use that phrase very broadly, have done over the years. But there are too many folks, there are too many governments, there are too many people who just say, oh, the problem is so hard. Let's wait. Let's see what comes next. I don't think we can do that. I think we've certainly, these conversations have started to happen leading up to the humanitarian summit next year about connectivity being a right, connectivity being something that people have the right to have, because it is such an enabling and an empowering tool. And I think certainly that's something that we ought to think about as saying, yeah, that makes sense to us. The first thing we all ask for when there's a disaster is connectivity. you may have seen David Miliband had an interview. David, do you remember where that it was posted on Medium? But I can't remember who did the interview. And he was talking about the questions that the Syrian refugees were asking when they get to Europe. What do you think they ask for first? Anybody got a thought? Okay, a little louder. That's number 2. The first question is where am I? Am I in Europe? Right? Do I get out of the boat or do I stay here? Second question they ask is, do I have Wi-Fi? Not food, not water, not clothes, not, hey, I cut my leg, I need a Band-Aid. Do you have Wi-Fi? And what's interesting, I think, about that is it's that same feeling we all get when we used to get on the plane and there was no Wi-Fi. I've been disconnected. I need to connect. And I also think it's a very human emotion, right? I am in crisis. I have landed somewhere relatively safe. I want to let someone know that I am safe. I need to connect. And that is, I think, an exceptionally powerful thing, not only from what it could tell us, but for the communities that we serve. I understand that need. I understand that need, and I think that it's incumbent upon us who often work in places where there isn't connectivity to say there are lots of reasons we need connectivity. Some of it's for M&E, some of it's for program scale, some of it's for this, but some of it is also because there is that need to connect, and it does let us, it will allow us in the future to do our work better. 2, I think we have to prepare for more data. How many folks, all the CIOs in this room, Microsoft and Vodafone, you don't get to answer this question. How many folks in this room feel like you're prepared for the massive amounts of data that you could potentially access in the next 5 years? Right. It's scary, right? Like, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to get it? What are the privacy rules around it? 80% of the data that we collect these days has no governing privacy rules whatsoever. 20% of it has either good or bad rules, depending on how you want to look at it. Certainly have different rules. How are we going to protect that data? How are we going to keep it safe? Some of that data is really sensitive. Some of that data, even though it's not sensitive under current law, is really sensitive if you look at it differently. They had a problem in San Francisco. People were watching the Uber maps, and they were watching the Uber car numbers that would gather around mosques at prayer times. And then people would refuse to take those Ubers. That an Uber car number is not personally identifiable information. It's not connected to the name of the driver until you log in and request an Uber. And then you're part of the system, so you've made it a certain concession. But people were watching. So how do we protect against those types of things so that data, even good data that might be very useful, because you want to know where the Ubers are if you need to get to the airport, how are we going to protect that data and keep people safe? And at the same point in time, balance it against the very legitimate concerns, or the very legitimate need to know where the Uber cars are. And then what kind of organizational and sector change do we need to do in order to use that data more effectively? We've talked about this in lots of working group meetings. We've talked about it at both summits that I've been to. We don't yet know how to share data. That is not unique to the nonprofit community. None of us know how to share data. I thought the Vodafone example was really interesting in sharing the data with their customer, but there's a contractual relationship there, and there's a shared benefit and a shared goal. So how do we do that in a world where today we might be working on the same problem, but maybe next week we aren't? How do we set those structures up, and then what does that mean in terms of us from an IT perspective, those of us that work in the IT world? How do we think about what kind of what kind of organizations we need to build? If less emphasis is on what kind of infrastructure do I build versus what kind of services do I procure and what kind of rules do I need to put in place and how do I be flexible and be able to attack all this data, that's a huge question that we're all struggling with. For those of you that were on the Rebecca Jacoby leadership's webinar a couple of weeks ago, she talked about the fact that Cisco had struggled with that. And if Cisco was struggling with it, how are we supposed to figure it out? So those are all questions that we're going to have to go and learn from folks that have done it well, and frankly from folks that have not done it well. But we need to say, okay, maybe as my mother used to always say, the thing that got you here isn't the thing that's going to get you there. And so now we have a choice. Do we want to stay here, or do we want to get over there? And I think that the opportunity that these unintended benefits of connectivity offer to us makes it pretty interesting to go over there. So how are we going to do that? I'm open for suggestions. And certainly as we think about the way that NetHope will lay out its work and the things that we will try and tackle over the next several years, well, look, here's 3 suggestions. You guys may tell me, none of this sounds right, Lauren. Let's go do something completely different. That's okay. But I want us to think about what that opportunity is, because while the opportunity from a technology perspective is really interesting, the technology from the impact perspective that we can have is also really interesting. So I think, that's 3 of the reasons that we have. I also think that that is the opportunity that's in front of us. How do we make sure that every kid looks that happy? Right? How do we make sure that those communities have connectivity? And what knowledge we can learn from the data that we have, that we can bring that to bear on those kids. And before I close, I want to make a plea to the IT people in the world. I started my career as a help desk person, so it's been a while. Don't ever ask me for, you saw me try and get PowerPoint started. You don't want to ask me for help desk anymore. But, back when help desk was a pencil sharpener, I was really good at it. But I want to make a plea to the technology people in the world, and I want to pick on Frederick. Where's Frederick? There he is. Okay, so when we were prepping this morning, and where's Greg? Because Greg's part of this too. Where's Greg Shorgan? He may not be in here. There's Greg. He says, "Look what Greg gave me," and it's this nifty little pin. And I'm like, "Wow, that's a nice pin." And then he pulls the ends off. It's a 10 gig USB key. How cool is that? And I thought, it is pretty cool. I like that kind of stuff. It's awesome. But as we think about the world that we live in this information technology world, we put a lot of emphasis on the T. What's the technology? What's the thing we're going to have? Is it 10 gig or is it 8 gig? I really want 10 gig. I have no idea what I'd put on a 10 gig pen, but gosh, I really got to have it. There's a new phone out. I got to have the new phone. I want the new phone. Someone told me the other day I need a new phone. Don't have one yet. We put a lot of emphasis on the T, and it is important. It is absolutely important. But the other thing that's really important is the I. What is the information that we are getting? What is the insight that we are getting from what the technology is bringing to us and laying at our feet? And how are we going to use it? The other thing that Eric Schmidt said in that very same panel was that in 5 years, the internet would go away. How many folks think the internet's going to go away in 5 years? Right. But what he meant is you won't even notice it in 5 years. You don't even notice 99.9% of the traffic that actually goes out across the internet, all those sensors that are out there, you don't see it. None of us see it. Until our networks go slow, then we really feel it. But we don't see it. And ultimately, it will simply fade into the background. It will simply be the way that things are. And so we've got to think about, what does our world look like in that world? What does our world look like when the internet goes away? And how do we take that I in the IT world that we've grown up in? How do we take that information and how do we make it actionable? And how do we make sure that that opportunity that sits before us, and as Frank said yesterday, with the technology partners that we have as part of NetHope, with the NGOs that we have, with the scope that you have and the missions that you have and the commitment that you have, and the donors that we have that are willing to support our work, the opportunity to have an impact is huge. And I think we should take it. And with that, I will simply say thank you.